Have you ever wondered about the story of God, as portrayed in the Bible? The story evolves drastically from its origins. In the early chapters of the Old Testament, God appears as a physical being who interacts directly with humans. He walks, talks, and even wrestles with people. Yet by the time we reach the New Testament, this same God is described as a spirit, entirely beyond human physicality. This shift raises critical questions. How did God lose his body? What does this transformation tell us about the nature of religion? And how do these changes reflect the broader cultural and philosophical developments in human history? Welcome back to Beyond Doctrine. And let's explore the inconsistencies and transformations in the portrayal of God, question the coherence of the biblical narrative, and examine how these shifts reflect deeper issues within religious thought. Ultimately, the evolving story of God reflects not a consistent divine nature, but rather the changing needs, beliefs, and philosophical influences of human society. The anthropomorphic God, physical encounters in the Old Testament. The early depictions of God in the Old Testament suggest a being who is deeply involved in the physical world. God is portrayed as having a body and interacting with humans in ways that are familiar to us. For example, in Genesis 3:8, God is heard walking in the Garden of Eden, suggesting that he has feet and can move around like a human. In Exodus 33:20-23, God shows his back to Moses, but warns that his face cannot be seen, implying that God possesses a face, a back, and a body. In Genesis 32:22-32, Jacob wrestles with a physical manifestation of God, leaving him with a limp, but also giving him a new name, Israel, after this direct physical encounter. In Genesis 18, God appears to Abraham in human form, shares a meal with him, and delivers important messages. These early depictions raise several important questions. If God has a body, does this limit his divine nature? Why would an all-powerful, omnipresent deity need to walk or wrestle, activities that suggest physical limitations? Moreover, why would God choose to manifest in human-like ways if he is supposed to be entirely different from his creation? These portrayals of God can be seen as an attempt by early human authors to relate to the divine in a way that is understandable. By giving God human traits, these stories make the divine accessible. However, this anthropomorphism also limits God, reducing him to a being that acts, reacts, and interacts like any other creature. This contradiction is difficult to reconcile with later theological claims about God's omnipotence and transcendence. The shift to an abstract, spiritual God, a theological reimagining. As we move further into the biblical narrative and into the New Testament, the portrayal of God undergoes a significant transformation. By the time we reach Jesus' teachings in John chapter 4:24, God is described as a spirit. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. This statement represents a radical shift from the earlier physical depictions of God. This change can be attributed to several factors, including the influence of Greek philosophy, particularly the dualism of Plato, which emphasized the separation of the material and spiritual worlds. Greek thought viewed the material world as inferior and the spiritual world as superior. As this philosophy permeated Jewish and Christian thought, it became increasingly untenable to think of God as a physical being. A purely spiritual God was more aligned with the philosophical ideas of perfection, immutability, and omnipresence. However, this shift introduces new problems. If God is now purely spiritual, what are we to make of the earlier physical encounters with him? Were these encounters metaphorical? Did God change his nature? Or are we simply seeing the influence of different cultural contexts shaping the biblical narrative over time? The shift from a physical to a spiritual God seems less like a revelation of divine truth and more like an adaptation to the changing philosophical and theological environment. Inconsistencies in divine action. God as the source of evil? The Bible contains numerous contradictions in its portrayal of God's actions and motives. In some passages, God is depicted as a benevolent, all-loving deity, while in others, he is the direct cause of suffering and disobedience. For instance, in Exodus chapter 4:21, God hardens Pharaoh's heart, preventing him from releasing the Israelites from slavery and leading to further plagues and suffering. In 1 Samuel chapter 2:25, God causes Eli's sons to disobey so that he can bring about their downfall, stating that it was the Lord's will to put them to death. In 2 Samuel 24:1, God incites David to take a census of Israel, which leads to a devastating plague, despite this census being seen as a sinful act. These examples show that God is not always the loving, merciful deity that later Christian theology emphasizes. Instead, he actively causes disobedience and suffering, raising difficult questions about the nature of divine justice and goodness. If God is the source of both good and evil, how are humans to understand the nature of morality? If God causes disobedience, how can humanity be held responsible for actions that are divinely orchestrated? This tension undermines the moral coherence of the biblical narrative. If God is capable of causing evil for his own purposes, then the distinction between good and evil becomes blurred. Religious teachings about free will and human responsibility are called into question when divine interference in human affairs leads to sin and suffering. Theological evolution. The influence of culture and philosophy. The evolution of the concept of God in the Bible reflects the broader cultural and philosophical developments of the ancient world. In the early stages of the Hebrew Bible, God's physicality and anthropomorphism reflect the ancient Near Eastern context in which the Bible was written. In this environment, gods were often depicted in human form, interacting directly with people. For example, the Mesopotamian gods, such as the gods of the Epic of Gilgamesh, were frequently portrayed as human-like in their behavior and appearance. As the Jewish people encountered Greek thought during the Hellenistic period, their understanding of God began to shift. Greek philosophy, especially the ideas of Plato and Aristotle, emphasized the importance of immateriality, perfection, and the separation of the physical and spiritual worlds. These ideas influenced Jewish and Christian thinkers, leading to a reimagining of God as a purely spiritual, transcendent being. This evolution of thought is not unique to Judaism or Christianity. Many ancient religions began with anthropomorphic gods who interacted directly with humanity, but over time, these deities became more abstract and distant. In ancient Egyptian religion, for example, the gods were initially depicted as physical beings with human and animal traits. Yet, over time, some gods, like Amun, were transformed into more abstract, universal deities. In this sense, the Bible's portrayal of God reflects the natural progression of religious thought. As human societies became more sophisticated, so too did their conception of the divine. What began as a human-like God became an abstract, omnipresent spirit. However, this progression raises critical questions about the nature of religious truth. If the concept of God can change so dramatically over time, what does that say about the reliability of religious teachings? Are these changes revelations of new divine truths, or are they simply the result of human adaptation to new cultural and philosophical environments? The incarnation of Jesus, a return to physicality or further confusion. The doctrine of the incarnation in Christian theology presents another set of contradictions. In the New Testament, Jesus is presented as God made flesh. In John 1:14 it says, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us." This statement appears to contradict the New Testament's earlier declaration that God is a spirit. John chapter 4:24. If God is purely spiritual, as the New Testament claims, how can he become flesh in the form of Jesus? The incarnation seems to reverse the earlier shift toward an abstract, immaterial God. Once again, we are faced with a physical God who walks, talks, and interacts with humanity. But this time, the physicality of God is presented as a unique event in the person of Jesus Christ, rather than a general characteristic of the divine. This return to physicality raises several theological and philosophical problems. If God can become physical in the form of Jesus, why is it necessary to reject the earlier Old Testament depictions of God's physical encounters with humans? Furthermore, if God's nature is truly unchanging, as Christian theology asserts, how can God's nature shift between spirit and flesh without contradicting the very essence of divinity? The Incarnation also introduces another layer of complexity in the relationship between God and humanity. If Jesus is both fully divine and fully human, as Christian theology claims, this duality creates a paradox. How can a being be both infinite and finite, both omnipresent and limited by time and space? The Incarnation, rather than clarifying the nature of God, adds further layers of confusion to an already inconsistent narrative. God and religion, a human creation. Given the contradictions, shifts, and transformations in the portrayal of God throughout the Bible, it becomes increasingly difficult to view the biblical narrative as a coherent and divinely inspired truth. Instead, it appears more likely that the concept of God and religion itself are human creations, evolving over time in response to changing cultural, philosophical, and political contexts. The early anthropomorphic depictions of God reflect the human need to understand the divine in familiar terms. As human society became more sophisticated, these depictions were no longer sufficient, and the concept of God was adapted to fit new philosophical paradigms. The influence of Greek thought on Jewish and Christian theology is a clear example of how religious beliefs are shaped by external cultural forces. The contradictions in the biblical portrayal of God, between physicality and spirituality, between justice and cruelty, between omnipotence and limitation, suggest that religion is not a divinely revealed truth, but rather a human attempt to make sense of the world. As our understanding of the universe evolves, so too does our concept of God. The evolving story of God, from a physical being who walks and talks with humanity to a purely spiritual entity beyond human comprehension, reflects the changing nature of religious belief over time. The inconsistencies in the biblical narrative, the influence of external philosophical ideas, and the contradictions in the portrayal of God's nature all point to a more human origin for the concept of God and religion. Rather than being a consistent and divinely revealed truth, the story of God is a reflection of humanity's evolving understanding of the world. As human societies have developed, so too has their conception of the divine, leading to a complex, often contradictory narrative that raises more questions than it answers. Ultimately, the shifting portrayal of God suggests that religion is not a static truth, but a dynamic, evolving system of belief shaped by human needs, desires, and philosophies.